Scientists are warning that some of our native plant species face extinction not only from changes in climate and shrinking habitat, along with fire risk, but because their own seed production has halved in the last 30 years. Dr. Joe Fontaine from Murdoch School of Veterinary and Life Sciences is one of a team of researchers across the country who've developed a concept they call the interval squeeze. And Joe, hello, just take us through what you mean, if you don't mind, by the interval squeeze.
Sure. Thank you very much, Michael. It's great to be with you. What we mean by the interval squeeze is that these plants are kind of facing a bit of a double whammy. As our climate gets hotter and drier, they're actually slowing down as they grow. So, when they germinate from a seed, and then they sort of grow into a seedling, and then slowly get larger, and then flower, and then create seeds, that takes longer. And at the same time, with the climate drying and warming, we actually have more fire out there. So it's a bit of a double whammy because they need longer, yet they actually have less time because there's more fire.
So, as you would expect, growth becomes inhibited when there's not what used to be, more available water supplies in terms of rainfall pattern falling over a certain habitat. So that would, I take it, be one of the factors in that slowing of growth.
That's exactly right. And so my co-authors, Neil Enright and Ross Bradstock from Wollongong and Dave Bowman from Tasmania, we've sort of been wandering around, and we've been, something you're aware of, but then when we actually began to sort of look at data, and we actually had data from WA where we had information going back to the 80s, and when we sort of began to look at that, it was like, wow, I mean, these plants are really growing a lot more slowly.
What kind of plants are we talking about?
We're talking about things like Banksias, sort of these iconic species that we really associate with us being Australian, and a whole raft of other plants that sort of grow sort of in these high diversity areas that, or in eucalypt forests that are very diverse. So
if you were looking at, say, WA, you'd be looking at that southwest pocket, that area around Margaret River and further south?
That would be included, but also WA has some other crown jewels away from Margaret River. I mean, of course, we all like our red wine and whatnot, but some of these beautiful heathlands that are really renowned for their flowers and high diversity. So further east of Margaret River towards Albany, or north of Perth towards Jurien Bay or Calberry, that's where some of these places are.
And in other parts of the country, where else can we see similar ecosystems suffering from slow growth, being also impacted or affected by fire?
Well, it'd be across parts of Australia where we expect, of course, globally the temperature's rising, but there's not everything is getting drier in the world, and so there's some places that are particularly targeted for getting drier as well. And unfortunately, wide parts of Victoria are also looking down the barrel of warmer and drier, so particularly around Melbourne.
Do Banksias and plants akin to that species rely on fire to actually drop seeds and germinate?
They do, and that's a really big part of the story here, is that we're talking about places that are fire dependent, and they have to have some fire. But what we're really raising the issue here is it's the frequency.
Right.
So the seeds absolutely need fire to germinate for those seedlings to establish. Yet it's kind of like it's the Goldilocks thing. We don't, it has to be just right.
Yeah, okay, so here's the irony. These plants need fire to germinate sometimes, but at the same time, if it's too frequent, they haven't had time to grow enough seeds to drop to even take that process to the next step.
That's absolutely right. And so what you could then see is over a couple decades is you have repeated cycles of fire, seedlings being dropped, germination, growing up, that basically the size of the population begins to decline. And then once you get to a certain point, you don't have any individuals left.
Now, Joe, here comes the other little whammy on this, if I can make this a triple whammy, because I'm going to force you now to reveal to people what you think we may need to do in some of these areas to help growth, because I think you're advocating we hold back on preventative fire measures.
Well, when we think about how we use fire and how we manage fire, and particularly how we manage risk, I mean, Victoria is actually leading the country right now in terms of beginning to have a rethink on fire management, and it's all about thinking about risk and what the biggest bang for the buck is in reducing risk to loss of homes or life or other human infrastructure. And what we're suggesting is in a year like particularly this year, where we have an El Nino forecast, so we're looking at drought, the suggestion is that this is a riskier year to do prescribed fire from a biodiversity point of view. And so this just is another piece of evidence that we can put into that idea of how we manage our risk, and this is a biodiversity piece.
But hang on, here's the other side of this argument. If it's going to be a drier year because of El Nino, doesn't that mean fire risk goes up? And if we don't do some hazard reduction burning during the cooler months, we could be facing such intensity of fire during the warmer months that some of the very species you're trying to protect would be wiped out anyway.
Aha, that's a very good question. And this is one of these complicated issues. It's not, there's no simplistic silver bullet answer here. What we're really trying to engage with is this idea that biodiversity is important, and we need to be thinking broadly about how we can conserve areas. And in this particular context, when we're saying, okay, well, fire could be worse this year, it could be more damaging, well, why not treat the highest risk areas first, which are the areas closest to where people live and
I think the term is peri-urban, isn't it? I think.
Yes, that's exactly. Peri-urban or wildland-urban interface. And if we treat those areas, those tend to be smaller in their extent, and therefore you're minimizing the risk to biodiversity and maximizing the return on your treatment.
So that's what you're advocating. If we're going to do some hazard reduction, let's be strategic about it and try and retain species where they're really struggling under that double whammy you've already described, but at the same time keeping those residential areas that are on the fringe of our cities and regional centres as safe as we can.
That's right. This is all a balancing act. Science is here to help inform the debate, but at the end of the day, you have some very well-trained and educated professionals who are trying to make these trade-offs and these decisions.
Are we facing a scenario that if we see this kind of decline in growth and therefore seed production continuing at pace as we have over the last 30 years that you've been able to measure, particularly in parts of WA, that we may actually see some of these native species like the Banksia, as you mentioned, fading away, just melding out of the landscape into nothingness?
Well, one of the issues we're really up against here is it's the rate of climate change that we're looking at.
Right.
I mean, a lot of scientists will say, well, or we hear in the media that, okay, well, plants will migrate. Okay, so if it's getting warmer and drier, they can migrate south. Well, the change is occurring at a rate that exceeds the pace at which these plants can move. So we just need to try to think about our own management so that plants can try to persist longer and have that time that they need to adapt. So I wouldn't sit here and tell you that I think a lot of species are going to go extinct simply because of this. No. But it's certainly a risk.
Are we also therefore relying on seed banks and some of the seeds that we now hold in storage in that facility in Norway for perhaps preserving for future generations some of the native species we now take for granted?
Well, certainly that is one part of our strategy to try to preserve biodiversity, but we'd be sort of fooling ourselves if we thought that was a successful strategy by itself. We certainly need to be thinking about maintaining populations in their natural environment, because that is the real space in which they're going to be able to adapt to changing conditions.
So when you've actually put this point of view, as we've been discussing, to some of the perhaps governing authorities when it comes to fire management where you live in WA, what's been the reaction?
I'd say it's a mixed bag. WA is in the current situation of beginning to think about pivoting from area burn to risk management, as Victoria has. And I think a lot of the fire managers that work away from the peri-urban are probably more comfortable with delaying fire, but it is there's still some generational change.
Well, good luck with that, because there are so many conflicting interests here that all seem to have equal validity depending on your argument. I wish you all the luck in the world.
Well, thank you. We're only trying to constructively add to the debate.
I know you are indeed so. Thank you very much, Dr. Joe Fontaine from Murdoch University School of Veterinary and Life Sciences in WA. I hope explaining to you and me the double whammy that is posed for native species in many parts of southern Australia that have been growing apace until the 1980s and now dropping off in growth because of the pressures upon them, like climate change, fire, and also, let's face it, us.